Hi, my name is Anna Drager, and I'm excited to announce to you our newest 4-H Horse Program YouTube channel video series, and that is our Hit the Trail series. So that is meant to prepare you and your horse for trail riding season. And video number one is all about how we can prepare our horse for trail riding. So, a lot of the topics that we're going to cover today are loosely based on how you would prep your horse for endurance riding, just because those two disciplines are going to come from the same standpoint where we're asking the horses to work for longer time frames and over varying difficulties in terrain. So, we're going to look at what creating a fitness program in that capacity looks like. We're also going to talk about the value of cross training and what that brings to the table for our horses, the various physical benefits that come from creating and carrying out an appropriate fitness plan for our horse, and then how we can make sure that we're keeping up with our nutritional needs as we increase that workload to our horse. So when we talk about creating a fitness program, that keyword fitness means that we're trying to maximize that horse's body efficiencies and minimize the amount of fatigue and the onset of fatigue that they're going to experience. So, what does creating a program look like? So, first and foremost, we want to make sure that we're spending time properly warming up and cooling down our horse outside of the primary work session. So, spending 15 minutes at the beginning, 15 minutes or so at the end to allow those horses, their muscles to warm up appropriately and get moving, and then at the end, cool down and clear out some of that lactic acid so that they can stay injury free and be ready for the next day's workload. We also want to think about doing any changes pretty gradually within the exercise program. If you've ever been to the gym after you've had some time off and you jump straight into the workout that you were doing before that time off, two things usually probably happen. One is that you're very sore the next day and you don't feel like going back for a long time. Secondly, you risk injuring yourself in that process, and that's no good. So we definitely want to avoid our horses getting injured and the process of getting them in shape and ready for big trail rides. So when you're creating the program, you also want to pay attention to three key components. So frequency, how often you're working that horse, intensity, how hard you're working the horse, and duration, how long you're working the horse. And I think it's really important to think about switching these up throughout. So if I'm working a horse 5 days a week, I'm not always riding them for 2 hours at walk trot. I want to think about mixing it up a little bit. Maybe I do a shorter ride that's more intense, where I have more canter work, maybe some gallop work as they get more fit. And then sometimes I'm going to spend a longer session just letting them work at a slower speed, more long and low in the bridle, something like that. Then you can also play with the frequency too, with which you're doing different exercises. So maybe I lunge them 1 day a week and ride 4 days a week. Maybe I start working them just 3 days a week. You can really be playful with that to accommodate the horse in their current condition and the goals that you have moving forward. So that kind of ties into the next point where we talk about what we want to do in the short term to prepare the horse for the long term. So always keeping that long-term goal in sight and creating small things in the direction of that are going to get us where we want to go. So one way to kind of consider this is dividing it up to 3 stages. So our preliminary stage, you're really looking at this time frame being over about 3 months or so by the time we're at that key high point of fitness. And our preliminary stage, depending on how long that horse has been on a break. So this is talking about bringing the horse out of the field. They've not been worked for a little while. You're looking at somewhere between 2 to 4 weeks where you're doing work that's a little bit lower in intensity, maybe starting low in duration and building up. I'm not going to just jump on that horse and go for a 2 hour ride, even if it's just a walk ride. I want to think about building them up in intensity and duration. Maybe I even start just 3 days a week at that point. Then developmental phase, I can start working them a little more intensely. So maybe I add in more canter work. Maybe we are working 5 days a week now. We can have rides that vary in duration. So maybe shorter, more intense rides and longer, slower rides to kind of mix it up a little bit. And then we can move after 4 weeks or so in that developmental phase, and we feel like the horse has adjusted appropriately to that exercise load and they're recovering really well, then we can move into higher speeds, maybe adding in some gallop work, maybe finding more difficult terrain that's appropriate to maybe a big trail ride we're working towards. We can start to be more specific to that and push them. So I wouldn't immediately hop out on a more intense trail ride when the horse has been on break for a long time. That wouldn't be fair, and that would risk that horse's health and risk injury. So really kind of working towards that to that specialized training section. So the importance of cross training has been highlighted a lot in human medicine, and I think it's also really important when we're talking about working our horses too. So partially we can think about this in terms of even work that's more geared towards their mind. So there's a lot of stresses that come with trail riding that might make even a fit horse have more stress and have more fatigue because of that, from a mental capacity. So taking time to also maybe do groundwork and obstacle training with your horse in preparation for going out on the trails more can be helpful. But also, even within the physical training, we want to make sure we're mixing it up a little bit so that we're spending time working on their strength training where we're going a little bit slower, maybe doing a lot of hills. Then we're spending some time in what I like to call horse yoga with the dressage exercises. So suppling work, lateral work, making sure they're soft and even on each side, developing straightness, and in general, just letting them release some of that tension that they might make when we are working a lot harder and faster or more strength focused work. And then you can also include interval training where we're working the horses at a certain level, maybe higher intensity for a certain time frame, and then dropping down to a lower level of work to allow them to recover. And then once they've hit that recovery time, bumping back up to a more intense level of work and repeating that multiple times. So your interval training in the beginning might start with maybe just walk trot intervals and then build to walk trot canter and then maybe even some gallop. You might want to start some of this stuff on flatter, really good footing, just so that you can make sure that you're hitting those intervals and not risking being in a tricky footing situation. So definitely is nice to kind of swing through these throughout your training week so that you're addressing all components of the horse's health. I am all for specificity of training, where certainly if I have a horse that I'm wanting to competitively trail ride with or do pretty intense trail rides with, that we need to be getting on the trails to a certain extent. But some of that arena time is also really important in conditioning specific to like interval training, where they're really working those systems and increasing their recovery, increasing their ability to recover from a certain level of workload. So when we talk about physical benefits of an exercise program, so you should start to kind of see these things happen. Basically, in essence, that your horse is performing better at a certain workload. But one thing that happens is we commit to a work plan and keep that steady with our horse is we have increased oxygen going to the muscles. And two reasons for that are that we actually get more capillaries there to supply the muscle, and then we also have an increased percentage of red blood cells and packed cell volume. So all these things that are bringing oxygen to the muscles are increasing in number, and that certainly helps that muscle function to a higher capacity, and that's because we've built them up in the training. We can also improve the horse's oxygen use capacity through regular training. That will help to delay lactic acid buildup in the horse because they're able to work more through that aerobic pathway. Then horses that are fit are better able to use those fuel sources, particularly those free fatty acids, as a fuel source. And that is what we know as the glycogen sparing effect, which also helps them delay the onset of fatigue. Finally, that skeletal system is able to adapt to that exercise load over time. So over 3-4 months or so, that calcium balance and bone density can increase, that we avoid microfractures and injuries, lameness, etc. Ultimately, we're hoping that our horse can adapt to handle a certain level of workload with greater ease. There are also some considerations you want to take into effect. We can have a horse going really well in a certain condition, and then if, say, we trailer them up and head out to a different area to ride that's pretty far away, it could have a different climate, and the horse may not be able to handle that as well. We just need to be paying attention to those factors and take that into account and how hard we're working our horse. So, environmental conditions, have you been riding in a hot and humid environment and you go to a really dry heat and vice versa? That's going to impact how that horse is able to cool themselves off and whether or not their systems are accustomed to that sort of climate. Anhidrosis is a condition where the horse has an inability to sweat. So some horses have this, and you just want to pay attention. So if you notice that they're really struggling, they're breathing really hard, their pulse rate's up, their body temperature will go up, obviously, because they're not able to cool off through that sweating mechanism. You're going to want to consult with your veterinarian about how you can address that and keep them happy and healthy and avoid the horse overheating and potentially collapsing. So, particularly if you've been out riding and you notice like you're sweating a lot, other horses you're riding with are sweating a lot, and your horse is really struggling to breathe and things like that, you want to take a minute and figure this out and make sure to address that issue. Tack fit. So one thing to think about, so when we start in that beginning phase, when we first pull the horse out of the pasture, they tend to be a little bit of a different shape. So there might be a little more fat involved. And by the end of that 3 or 4 month period, we can have a totally differently shaped horse in terms of that muscle is developed, they've lost that fat, become a little more trim. So we want to make sure we're making any adjustments to our tack to help avoid any sore muscle spots and also any saddle sores and things like that. The other thing to think about is if you have worked them up to a sweat, that you're hosing them down after the ride, not just to cool them off, but also to avoid any sweat drying and creating skin irritation, which can also lead to saddle sores. Then also consider what difficulty level you've been riding before you go to a different place. So if your horse is accustomed to riding on grass and kind of softer terrain, what's that going to look like when they are suddenly riding on a really compact surface? Maybe they haven't built up, the skeletal system hasn't adjusted to that to be able to handle that concussion as much. You also want to consider riding if you've been riding on a more compact surface and then you go and ride on something like sand, that horse is going to have to work a little harder in order to move through that as well. So they might tire a little bit faster and struggle a little bit more in that situation. So you might need to adjust the time frame or the speed or intensity of which you're riding the horse in that scenario. If you look at this right here, so we were out in Arizona, this area is not too bad, but by the time you get up in here, it gets really rocky. So that's an example of if a horse wasn't used to really big rocks and having to kind of pick their way through, that's really exhausting work. So they're going to tire a little faster than they would if they're just used to riding on well-groomed grass trails. Next up, we're going to talk about nutritional demands. So as we're increasing that horse's workload, we want to make sure that we're adjusting their feed plan appropriately, and that requires an understanding of that base nutrition as well. So horses at a maintenance level, so meaning no work, just kind of resting in the field, not doing anything, they need anywhere from 2 to 2.5% of total feed per day. So that includes anything, forage, concentrate, 2 to 2.5% of their body and food per day. So if you think about 1,000-pound horse, that's somewhere between 20 to 25 pounds of food. If you end up increasing that horse's workload, then we obviously need to increase that nutritional amount. Now, that being said, sometimes that maintenance requirement is going to vary a little bit to the individual. Some horses are a little more efficient than others with food. So, for example, my two Icelandics do very well at the lower end of that nutritional need versus a thoroughbred. It's going to push a little bit higher just to maintain a certain weight at a maintenance level. We always want to start with a forage first diet with our horses. So if we have adequate pasture, that's awesome. We want to start there. If we don't have quite enough pasture and we're adding in hay, we want to make sure that we're adding that in as appropriate. And then if those two things happen and we've increased the workload and they're no longer able to eat enough forage, or the forage quality isn't high enough to account for that, then we might think about adding in concentrate. The thing with that is because of horses' systems being set up for that forage first diet, we want to make sure that the amount of concentrate that we're adding in is no more than 50% of their ration so that we can help avoid any digestive upset. So if you're starting to make changes within a horse's diet in order to account for the increased workload, you just want to make sure that you're doing that slowly over time because they can be really sensitive to changes in their food. Water, so horses can drink up to 12 gallons of water per 24-hour period when we're in standard environmental conditions and they're not at work, so maintenance level. You just want to know that as horses are working harder and sweating a lot, then they're probably going to drink quite a bit more, especially under certain environmental conditions. So just making sure that you're offering your horse fresh, clean water, especially when you're on those trips and riding quite a bit, is going to be really important. Energy sources. So horses, when we're riding horses over a long period of time, we really want to focus on fats and carbohydrates as their primary energy source. Proteins, digestion tends to create more heat, which we want to avoid in the horse because then that we're already fighting them to keep them cooler. So a form of digestion that adds a little extra heat still isn't going to be very helpful in that scenario. So carbohydrates come in two different forms, so that's our non-structural and our structural. Our non-structural tend to be our sugars and starches that we find in grains, and those are broken down in the horse's foregut. So when we start feeding diets that are really high in starch, so if we cross over that 50% barrier especially, some of those starches end up in the horse's hindgut, where the microbes break them down, and then it creates a really acidic environment in the horse's cecum, which is detrimental to the populations of microbes, and it can also be detrimental to the general integrity of the horse's hindgut. So that can start to create some issues. The form of energy that they're getting from those starches is a little bit more of like a sugar rush, so it spikes and then it falls. Versus when we rely more on those structural carbohydrates, so cellulose coming more from their forage, that's digested broken down by the microbes in the hindgut. And then that creates a little bit steady energy for the horse, which is what we would want in a situation when we're riding over a long distance of time. We want them to have more steady, not spikes and falls. Then we fats are a particularly good option too for our distance horses because they can provide up to 3 times as much energy per gram as glucose that we're going to see in more of our sugar components. So definitely want to pay attention to how we're providing those energy sources into our horse's diet. The other important thing, especially when you're talking about horses that are working hard, sweating a lot, is paying attention to our electrolyte balance. So this is controlling the fluid balance in the horse's cells. It also is involved in nerve impulses and muscle contractions. So there's a lot of different versions of electrolytes out there. You can have electrolyte pastes. There are top dressings that can go on feeds. And even just putting out a salt block free choice can be okay for some of the lower levels of exercise. But definitely, if you're working your horse pretty hard, this is something to consider. So the primary ones the horses are going to lose in large quantities are going to be sodium, chloride, and potassium. Then we can also need to pay attention to calcium, magnesium, and some other trace minerals that they'll also lose in sweat, but to lower degrees. So again, if you're making feed adjustments to help your horse maintain body condition, you just want to pay attention that you're making those changes gradually. So don't just like suddenly change it the day of the ride and suddenly feed them a ton more food. You just want to build that up slowly and really have a plan. So like I was talking about earlier, we really want to rely more on those fat stores and glycogen stores in the liver and muscles. So building up those stores because the horse that's riding over a long distance time frame, working pretty hard, some more of your endurance trail style horse isn't going to be able to eat during that ride enough to replenish what they're using. So they need to have that stored up a little bit. Also, a horse can only eat so much forage at a time, so we want to make sure that the forage that they are eating is of high quality. What does quality forage look like? So we're looking for early maturity forages, meaning that we have more leaves, they're softer stems, and they're not going to have too many seed heads present. Typically, our endurance focused horses are going to focus more on that grass or alfalfa mix as opposed to a pure alfalfa. And that goes back to what I was mentioning earlier, is that breakdown of protein creates more heat in the horse's body, which we want to avoid when they're already working pretty hard and we're trying to create less heat. If you're feeding your horse quite a bit of forage or as much as they can possibly eat in that time frame, and they're not able to maintain an adequate body condition score, then we can add in some concentrate to help them um, meet that difference in need. So you can create mixes from more raw ingredients, so corn, barley, oats, things like that. But there are a lot of really good formulated feeds that are out there that are created by equine nutritionists. And those are nice because they're going to actually go in and fortify the feed and balance it so that it's specifically meeting the nutritional requirements for horses. And they range anything from ration balancers to high fat, high fiber feeds. We tend to stay away from high starch feeds for that reason that I mentioned earlier, is the fibrous feeds are gonna and the fat feeds are gonna keep a little more of a level energy supply to the horse as opposed to our starchy feeds. And the ration balancer is one thing to mention here. So that's going to be more just packed with vitamins, minerals, and protein. And that can sometimes be okay when you're like first starting off, or some breeds of horses are a little more efficient. That works. Just be aware that if you're noticing the horse isn't keeping as much weight, you're going to want to shift more towards that high fat, high fiber feed. And then if you've added concentrate and you've got really high quality forage that you're feeding the horse and you feel like they still need a little bit more, we can add fat through different oil types. So there's a lot of them out there. So vegetable, corn, canola, you can see kind of the list there. And you can add as much as 3 to 4 ounces of oil per feeding to their feed. You just want to make sure that you do that over a time period, just like anything else, because they can end up having digestive upset. Sometimes that extra oil will also turn them off their feed. So just making sure to add that in slowly so that they continue to eat and get that extra fat content. Beet pulp is another option, partly to if you have a horse that's prone to choke, or if you want to get a little more water into their diet, you can also soak beet pulp. It comes in a variety of styles from pellets to shredded. It is high in fermentable fiber, which is great, but it is really nutritionally imbalanced. So that's where it's nice if you buy some of these formulated feeds that are high fat, high fiber, they'll actually have beet pulp in it already, but then they've balanced it appropriately to account for the fact that beet pulp isn't as balanced in terms of fat, protein, and vitamins. So ultimately, if you have been increasing your feed quality and you've increased the amounts of food, but you still aren't seeing the results that you'd like, that your horse isn't keeping that weight that you'd like, then you need to consult with a veterinarian and rule out any potential health issues. So horses that have gastric ulcers, or there could be a dental issue that's keeping them from being able to make use of that feed as well, or get or take that in. And then also parasitic infections. There are a host of things that could be going on, so it's good to work with your veterinarian and rule things out to make sure to get them on track. The other thing is, if you're not familiar with the body condition scoring system or want more tips on how to get your horse to gain weight, there are a couple references at the end of this slide that are through UK Equine Extension, and you can definitely reference those for ideas. So after the ride, you just want to make sure that you cool the horse down properly. You want to make sure they get rehydrated, that you're observing them for any signs that they're really struggling and not recovering well, and take that into account and be ready to help them as needed. Then, if the horse is going back and going to go on break, then you want to make sure that you're adjusting their diet gradually and kind of stepping them down gradually too. So actually, a little bit of light activity after a really strenuous ride can be good to help them clear out that lactic acid and settle back in and recover a little bit faster as opposed to just throwing them in a stall or even just putting them out in the field. It's good to provide some light work to help kind of bring them back down. You also want to make sure that if that workload is lower, you're dropping the diet down so they don't have those excess calories and put on extra weight that they don't necessarily need because they're at a lower workload. So all this to say, when you're creating a fitness program, you need to pay attention to the nutritional and physical demands to the horse. So each of these components are really important independently, but they're also very important to come together, and that's going to give you the best final outcome. Proper conditioning takes time, so there's just no real substitute for taking the proper time to make sure your horse is prepared for an event. And then just making sure as those exercise demands shift up or down, that you might need to shift their diet plan up and down and play with what works and what doesn't work for the individual because they're all a little bit different and they all have their preferences as well. So working with your horse, working with your veterinarian, and just making the plan that's going to be best for them. Thank you all so much for tuning into this video. I hope we'll see you next week for preparing the rider. If you have any questions, you can use this contact information to reach out to me, and I'll go ahead and share some extra reading that you can definitely check out. These two sources are from our University of Kentucky Extension, and it talks all about helping a horse put on weight and walks through that body condition scoring system, especially for a thin horse. I hope you guys enjoyed, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.